In April of 1823, a converted cargo ship out of Cork Harbor dropped anchor in New York with 400 Irish men packed below her waterline. Every one of them carried a handbill printed in English they could barely read, promising paid passage to America, 50 cents a day in wages, 3 meals, and a daily ration of whiskey. They were told they would be digging a canal across New York State. They were not told that by Christmas of that same year, 90 of them would be dead. This is the story of the 9,000 Irish workers who carved the Erie Canal out of raw wilderness with nothing but shovels, wheelbarrows, and their own bleeding hands. 363 miles of ditch, 8 feet deep, 40 feet wide, cut through limestone, swamp, and forest from Albany to Buffalo. 83 locks. 18 aqueducts crossing rivers that had no business being crossed. And approximately 1,000 Irish workers who died doing it, most of them buried where they fell, in graves no one marked and no one remembers. But here is what you need to understand before we go any further. This canal was supposed to be impossible. Every engineer in the country said so. The United States in 1817 did not have a single school of civil engineering. Not one. There was no West Point program for canal builders. There was no textbook. The longest canal in America at the time was 27 miles long, a modest project in Massachusetts, and it had nearly bankrupted the state that built it. DeWitt Clinton, the governor of New York who staked his entire political career on this project, was proposing something more than 13 times that length. Through terrain no surveyor had fully mapped, across country choked with bedrock, old-growth forest, glacial ridges, and mosquito-infested swamp. His critics called it Clinton's Ditch. They called it Clinton's Folly. They said it would drain the state treasury and leave nothing but a muddy scar across the wilderness. Thomas Jefferson himself said it was a project that might be feasible in 100 years, but was little short of madness to attempt now. They were wrong about the folly. They were right about the scar. Because the men who made this canal real, the men who turned a politician's dream into 363 miles of navigable waterway, were not American engineers. They were not surveyors or college-educated gentlemen with transit levels and brass instruments. They were Irish Catholic immigrants from counties Cork, Galway, and Tipperary, recruited straight off famine roads and tenant farms, by contractors who posted leaflets in Irish ports, the way you might post an advertisement for day labor at a hardware store. Come to America. Dig a canal. Get paid. Start a new life in a country where no English landlord can evict you. What those leaflets did not mention was that the passage money would be deducted from their wages. Week after week, the crossing fee came out of their pay before they ever saw a coin. That the 50 cents a day would shrink further after deductions for tools, food, and lodging in shanty camps that were little more than mud-floored lean-tos covered with bark and scrap timber. That the whiskey ration, 1 quart per day distributed every 2 hours in tin cups along the digging line, was not generosity. It was a calculation. Drunk men complain less. Drunk men work longer. Drunk men do not organize. Drunk men dig until they drop. And what those leaflets absolutely did not mention was the Montezuma swamp. If you are watching this and you care about the people who built this country with their hands, not with speeches, not with legislation, but with iron and sweat and bone, I would ask you to subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories that disappear if nobody tells them. Now, the Montezuma swamp. The canal route, as planned by the surveyors, ran straight through the Montezuma marshes, a vast lowland swamp near the north end of Cayuga Lake in central New York. The engineers knew it would be difficult. They could see the standing water on the survey maps, could smell the rot in the air when they walked the proposed route in their tall boots and linen coats. But they did not know it would be a killing ground. The swamp stretched for miles in every direction, a flat, featureless expanse of standing water, cattails, dead timber, and rotting vegetation where the air itself seemed to thicken in the summer months into something you could almost chew. Clouds of mosquitoes rose in columns so dense that men wrapped their faces in cloth and still breathed them in. The water was black with tannin from decaying plant matter. The mud beneath it had no bottom. You could push a shovel handle straight down, 8 feet, 10 feet, and never hit anything solid. Just more mud, cold, and sucking and endless. The contractors sent Irish crews into the Montezuma section in the spring of 1819. The work was unlike anything on the rest of the canal. There was no solid ground to stand on. Men dug waist-deep in stinking water, hauling muck into wheelbarrows that sank into the mud under their own weight and had to be dragged out by hand, by rope, by whatever could get a grip on them. The heat in summer was suffocating, the kind of heat that sits on your chest and does not lift. The mosquitoes were relentless, biting through shirts, through wrappings, through anything the men could put between themselves and the swarms. And within weeks of the first crews arriving, men began falling sick. They called it the shakes, the ague, the fever and chills that came in waves. First the shivering so violent a man could not hold a shovel, then the burning heat that left skin hot to the touch, then drenching sweat that soaked through clothing, and left men lying on the ground, too weak to stand. What it actually was, though no one understood it at the time, was malaria. Plasmodium parasites carried by the Anopheles mosquitoes that bred in the millions across the standing water of the Montezuma marshes. The fever came in cycles, each one worse than the last. Chills so violent a man's teeth cracked from clenching. Then burning heat that made his eyes swim and his vision blur. Then a brief reprieve, maybe a day, maybe two, before it started again. Men who survived one cycle often did not survive the third or fourth. Their bodies simply gave out. Their hearts stopped in the night, or their organs failed in the afternoon heat, and they died on the same ground they had been digging that morning. Patrick Sullivan was one of the ditchers assigned to the Montezuma section. He was from County Cork. His name appears in the contractor payroll books that still exist in the New York State Archives, written in fading ink in a clerk's careful hand. He was paid 50 cents a day, same as every other man on the line. He worked a 12-hour shift with a long-handled shovel, standing in water that came to his thighs, lifting muck and roots and clay into a wheelbarrow and pushing it to the bank, over and over, from first light until the sun dropped behind the tree line. The records do not tell us how old he was. They do not tell us whether he had a family back in Cork, a mother waiting for letters that stopped coming, a wife who never learned what happened. They tell us only that his name stops appearing in the payroll ledger in August of 1819. He was one of the men who did not survive the Montezuma section. Where he was buried, no one recorded. There is no stone with his name on it anywhere in New York State. There is only the ledger and the absence where his name used to be. But the canal kept moving. This is the part that still staggers me when I think about it. The death rate in the Montezuma section was catastrophic. Entire crews were laid low with fever, half a team gone in a week, replaced by fresh recruits off the next ship who did not yet know what the swamp would do to them. Contractors pulled men out, waited for cooler weather when the mosquitoes retreated, then sent new crews in come spring. And the new crews dug. They dug because they had no other option. They had crossed an ocean on borrowed passage money. They owed the contractors for the ship, for the tools, for the food they were eating. They could not go home. They could not afford passage back even if they wanted it. The canal was the only work available, and the work was killing them, and they did it anyway. Every morning, back into the water. The engineering challenges alone should have stopped the project cold, even without the disease. Consider what these men were actually doing with their hands. They were cutting a channel 8 feet deep and 40 feet wide, through terrain that included old-growth forest, where individual trees were 4 and 5 feet in diameter, bedrock ridges that had been laid down hundreds of millions of years ago, and river crossings where the current ran fast and the banks were soft and unstable. They had no dynamite. Alfred Nobel would not invent that for another 4 decades. They had no steam-powered machinery of any kind. They had axes, shovels, wheelbarrows, black powder for blasting, and a device called a stump puller, a massive wooden wheel mounted on an axle with a chain and a hand crank, designed to wrench tree stumps out of the ground by brute leverage. 1 stump at a time. 1 wheelbarrow load at a time. 1 foot of canal at a time, for 8 years. The aqueducts are what break my understanding of what human labor can accomplish. 18 of them along the route. An aqueduct, in canal terms, is not a bridge you walk across. It is a bridge that holds an entire canal, full of water, with loaded boats floating on it, suspended in the air above a river valley. Think about the weight of that. Water weighs 8 pounds per gallon. A canal 40 feet wide and 8 feet deep, running across an 800-foot bridge, holds millions of pounds of water. And boats, on top of that. The aqueduct at Rochester carried the canal over the Genesee River, 802 feet long, supported by 11 massive stone arches. Every stone in those arches was quarried by hand from local deposits, cut to precise dimension by hand with chisels and measuring lines, hauled to the site by horse, hoisted into position by hand-cranked derricks, and set into place by masons working from wooden scaffolding that swayed in the wind above the river below. Irish hands did that work. Irish backs carried those stones up those ramps. And the locks. 83 locks along 363 miles, each one a precision-engineered chamber designed to raise or lower a canal boat from one water level to another. The tolerances had to be exact. The gates had to seal perfectly, timber against timber, with no gap for water to force through. The walls had to withstand the hydraulic pressure of thousands of gallons pressing against them every time a boat passed through, every single day, for decades. This is where Canvas White enters the story, and I want you to understand what this man figured out, because it changed the entire project and arguably changed the country. White was a young American engineer, one of the very few working on the canal who had any formal training at all, and he was sent to England to study British canal construction. He walked hundreds of miles along English canals, sketching, measuring, asking questions of every lockkeeper and mason he could find. He came back to New York with something no one in America had ever produced: hydraulic cement. A mixture made from a specific type of limestone that, when ground to fine powder and combined with water, hardened into stone even when fully submerged. Ordinary mortar dissolved underwater. It crumbled and washed away and left gaps that widened with every passing season. White's hydraulic cement set like granite beneath the surface and stayed set year after year under constant water pressure. He developed it from limestone deposits found near Chittenango, New York, and without it, the locks could not have been built. Not one of them. Every one of those 83 locks was mortared with Canvas White's cement. Every aqueduct. Every culvert. Every retaining wall that held back a river or a hillside along the entire 363-mile route. A material invented by one man, mixed by hand in wooden troughs and applied by trowel by thousands of Irish workers who had never heard of hydraulic cement before they set foot in America and were handed a bucket of gray powder and told where to put it. Therefore, the canal was not just a feat of political will. It was a feat of improvisation on a scale this country had never attempted. Of solving problems that had no precedent in American engineering, using labor recruited from the poorest counties in Ireland, directed by self-taught engineers who were learning as they went, all of them working under conditions that would shut down any modern construction site in an hour. The deep cut at Lockport is where the impossibility of this project becomes physically real in a way that words strain to convey. I have walked the original canal bed at Lockport. I have stood at the bottom of that cut and looked up at the walls of solid Lockport dolomite rising on either side, sheer and pale gray, still showing the drill marks from 2 centuries ago. And when you stand there, when you tilt your head back and see the sky as a narrow strip of blue between those rock walls, you understand something that no book can fully communicate. They cut through this, by hand, with chisels and hammers and black powder and nothing else. The dolomite at Lockport is one of the hardest geological formations in the northeastern United States. It does not crumble under a hammer blow. It does not fracture neatly along clean lines the way slate or sandstone might. It resists everything you throw at it, and what it does surrender, it surrenders in jagged, unpredictable chunks that can kill a man standing 20 feet away. And the canal needed to pass through this formation. Not over it, not around it, through it. A cut nearly 3 miles long and as deep as 30 feet in places, carved out of living rock by men whose only tools were iron chisels, sledgehammers, and barrels of black powder. Michael Riley was a foreman of an Irish drilling team at Lockport. His job was to oversee the men who drilled the blasting holes into the dolomite face. The process was simple in concept and terrifying in practice. A man would hold a long iron drill rod, 3 feet of cold iron with a sharpened tip, against the rock face, while another man swung a sledgehammer to drive it in. Strike after strike after strike, rotating the rod a quarter turn between blows to keep the hole round and prevent the rod from binding in the stone. One held, one swung. If the man swinging the hammer missed by even an inch, if his grip slipped on the wooden handle, if his arms gave out from exhaustion at the wrong moment, the man holding the rod lost his hand, or his arm, or his life. They called the holders strikers and the swingers sledgemen, and the trust between them was total, absolute, not subject to negotiation, because it had to be. You do not hold an iron rod against solid rock while a man swings a 12-pound hammer at your hands unless you trust that man the way you trust your own heartbeat. Once the hole was drilled deep enough, they packed it with black powder, tamped it down with a wooden rod, set a fuse of slow-match cord, cleared the area as far as the narrow cut would allow, and lit it. The explosions sent shards of dolomite flying in every direction, razor-edged fragments of stone that could take a man's eye or open his skull from 50 feet away. Men were killed by flying rock. Men were killed by premature detonations when the powder caught a spark before the fuse was lit. Men were killed by fumes, the choking sulfur smoke from the black powder that hung in the confined space of the cut because there was no wind at the bottom to carry it away. The contractor records at Lockport do not give us a complete death toll for the deep cut, but the graves are there. Some of them, scattered in church plots and old cemeteries around Lockport, with headstones so weathered by 2 centuries of New York winters that you can barely trace the letters with your finger. And those are only the men whose deaths someone thought worth recording. Riley kept his teams working through conditions that would be unimaginable on any job site operating today. Dust so thick from the hammering and blasting that men worked blind, feeling for the rock face with outstretched hands. Noise from the constant pounding of iron on stone that left men permanently deaf before they reached 30 years old. The acrid, throat-closing sting of black powder smoke that never fully cleared from the bottom of the cut, that coated the inside of your throat and your nostrils and turned your spit black by midday. And still, foot by foot, they went deeper into the stone. The deep cut took nearly 3 years to complete. 3 years of drilling, blasting, hauling broken rock out in wheelbarrows on ramps cut into the stone walls, dumping it, walking back down into the dust and smoke, and doing it again. When it was finished, the canal passed through solid stone at Lockport in a series of 5 combined locks, stair-stepping boats up and over the Niagara escarpment in one of the most remarkable feats of construction anywhere on the North American continent. Built by Irish immigrants who had never seen a canal lock before they were told to build one. But the worst was still coming. And the men who would suffer it had no warning at all. In 1832, 7 years after the canal opened, cholera arrived in the canal communities. The disease had been sweeping across Europe in waves, and it came to North America on immigrant ships, the same ships that were still bringing Irish workers to the canal for maintenance and expansion work. Cholera is a bacterial infection spread through water contaminated with human waste, and the canal communities, with their shanty camps built 10 feet from the waterline, their open latrines dug within spitting distance of their drinking sources, their shared cooking pots and common water barrels, were breeding grounds of extraordinary efficiency for the bacterium. The outbreak of 1832 killed an estimated 500 canal workers along the route. 500 men. In a single season of death, the disease struck with a speed that defied comprehension. A man could be working his section of the line at dawn, feeling the first sharp cramp in his gut by mid-morning, and dead before the sun set that same evening. The symptoms were violent. Severe cramping that doubled men over where they stood. Uncontrollable purging that drained the body of every fluid it possessed. Dehydration so rapid and so complete that a man's skin turned blue-gray, his eyes sank into the hollows of his skull, and his face became unrecognizable to the men who had shared breakfast with him that same morning. There was no treatment that worked. There was no understanding of how the disease spread. The prevailing medical theory was miasma, bad air rising from swamps and filth, and the official response was to burn tar barrels along the canal to purify the atmosphere. It did nothing. The men kept dying. Thomas O'Brien survived. He was an Irish canal worker, one of the men still employed on maintenance and expansion work along the route in 1832, and he lived through the cholera epidemic. The contractor records show his name on the payroll before and after the worst months. The records do not tell us how he survived when 500 of his fellow workers did not. They do not tell us whether he nursed others who were dying, whether he carried water to men who could no longer stand, or whether he simply possessed the constitution and the luck to endure what the disease threw at his body. They tell us only that he was there, that he saw it all, that he lived through it, and that he went back to work on the canal when the dying stopped. Because what else was a man like Thomas O'Brien going to do? Hundreds of others were not that fortunate. They were buried in mass graves along the canal route, in patches of ground that were never consecrated by a priest, never marked with a stone or a cross, and in many cases never recorded in any document at all. The contractors had no legal obligation to document the dead. The workers had no families nearby to claim their bodies or insist on a proper burial. They were lowered into the ground, sometimes wrapped in a blanket, sometimes in nothing at all, and covered over with the same earth they had been digging the day before, and the work continued without them. If you have stayed with this story this far, you understand something that most Americans never learn about how this country was actually built. I would be grateful if you would subscribe, because there are hundreds of stories like this one, and they deserve to be heard. The canal opened on October 26, 1825, 8 years, and approximately $7 million after construction began. Governor DeWitt Clinton stood on the bow of a packet boat called the Seneca Chief at Buffalo and ceremonially poured a barrel of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean at Sandy Hook in New York Harbor. They called it the Wedding of the Waters. It was a ceremony of triumph, a political vindication. Clinton had wagered everything on this canal, his reputation, his career, his legacy, and he had won. The newspapers covered the opening ceremony with enthusiasm. They wrote about Clinton's vision. They wrote about the engineers and their ingenuity. They wrote about the economic transformation that was already beginning to reshape New York into the unquestioned commercial capital of the United States. They did not write about the Irish. Not one name. Not one line of acknowledgement. Not one sentence about the 9,000 men who had actually dug the canal with their hands, or the approximately 1,000 who had died in the doing of it. The men who built the canal were invisible on the day it was celebrated. They had always been invisible. That was the arrangement. The economic impact was immediate. Before the canal, shipping goods from Buffalo to New York City cost $100 per ton and took 2 weeks by wagon over mountain roads that turned to mud in the spring and ice in the winter. After the canal, it cost $10 per ton and took 3.5 days by boat on calm water. Freight costs dropped 90%. The price of Western grain at New York markets fell to levels that made it affordable for ordinary people, which meant farmers in the western part of the state could sell more of it, which meant more land cleared, more farms established, more towns built, more commerce flowing in every direction. New York City became the busiest port in the Western Hemisphere within a decade of the canal's opening. Manhattan's population doubled. Wall Street consolidated its position as the financial center of the young nation. Land values along the canal route increased by a factor of 5 within a decade. Towns that had been crossroads with a general store became shipping hubs with warehouses, hotels, and banks. The canal did not just connect two bodies of water. It connected the interior of a continent to the global economy. And every ton of grain and timber and manufactured goods that floated down that waterway floated in a channel that Irish hands had dug out of the earth. I have stood at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, where many of the unmarked Irish canal worker graves are believed to lie. There is no monument there for them. There is no plaque. There is no statue of a man holding a long-handled shovel. There is a section of the grounds where the earth is uneven in ways that suggest old, sunken burials, and there is historical documentation from the 1820s indicating that canal workers who died during the western sections of construction were interred there in common graves. But there is nothing you can point to and say with certainty, here lies a man who built this country. The same is true at Watervliet near Albany, where workers from the eastern sections were buried. The graves are there, somewhere beneath the grass and the silence. The names are not. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 men died building 363 miles of canal that transformed a nation, and we cannot name most of them. We know Patrick Sullivan's name because a contractor's clerk wrote it in a payroll book to track his daily wages. We know Michael Riley's name because he was a foreman, and foremen were documented because they were responsible for company equipment. We know Thomas O'Brien's name because he survived the cholera and kept drawing pay. But the men who died of malaria in the Montezuma swamp, the men killed by flying stone at Lockport, the men who doubled over with cholera cramps in 1832 and were dead by sundown, most of them exist now only as a number. Approximately 1,000 dead. That is a statistic. It is not a memorial. The whiskey ration tells you everything about how these men were regarded by the people who employed them. 1 quart per day per worker, distributed every 2 hours along the digging line in tin cups. That is not a benefit. That is not kindness or generosity from a grateful employer. That is a management strategy, calculated and deliberate. Keep the men slightly drunk at all times throughout the working day. Dull the pain in their backs and their shoulders and their cracked, blistered hands. Dull the fear of the swamp water rising around their waists, the rock dust filling their lungs, the fever taking hold in the man working beside them. A man who has been drinking since 6 in the morning does not think clearly about the fact that his passage money is being docked from wages that barely cover the cost of food on the days the camp cook has enough to feed everyone. A man who is drinking does not organize. A man who is drinking digs. The contractors understood human desperation with the precision of accountants. They recruited from the poorest regions of Ireland because desperate men do not negotiate their terms. They deducted passage money from wages because indebted men do not walk away from the job. They provided whiskey because numbed men do not revolt. And they buried the dead without markers because unmarked graves do not generate questions from authorities or newspapers. This was not cruelty practiced for its own satisfaction. It was economics. Cold, functional, efficient economics. Every mile of canal had a contract price per rod of earth moved, and the cheapest variable in the entire equation was the cost of replacing the men who moved it. But I do not want you to carry only grief away from this story, because grief alone is not the full truth of what happened along the Erie Canal. These 9,000 Irish ditchers and drillers and haulers and masons built something that outlasted every contractor who profited from their labor and every politician who claimed credit for their work. The contractors are forgotten now, their names preserved only in ledger books that scholars consult. The politicians, with the single exception of Clinton, are footnotes. The investors who financed the canal are entries in financial archives that no living person has opened in years. But the canal itself endured for generations. And the communities that the Irish workers planted along the route, the shanty camps that became neighborhoods, that became parishes, that became proper towns with churches and schools and main streets, those endured too. Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, Utica, Rome, Lockport. These cities exist in their present form because Irish canal workers settled along the route when their sections were finished, and they stayed. They married local women or women from the next ship. They had children. They built churches out of the same stone they had quarried for the locks. They built American lives out of the same dirt they had been digging. The Erie Canal was the first great proof that the interior of North America could be connected to the wider world. Before the canal existed, the Appalachian Mountains were a wall that divided the continent. Everything west of that wall was isolated, expensive to reach, and economically irrelevant to the cities of the eastern seaboard. The canal punched a hole through that wall of geography and distance. And the men who punched it were immigrants who had crossed an ocean with nothing but a handbill and a name, who were promised 50 cents a day and a cup of whiskey, and who delivered something that no American-born engineer or politician could have delivered without them. When you drive across New York State on the Thruway, you are following the route they dug. When you pass through Lockport, you are passing over the deep cut that Michael Riley's teams hammered and broke through solid dolomite with nothing but iron and black powder. When you see the flat, quiet stretches of land near Montezuma, you are looking at the swamp where Patrick Sullivan worked his last shift. The ground itself is their memorial, if you know how to read it. You can still see the towpath in places. The narrow dirt path that ran alongside the canal where mules walked in harness, pulling boats westward by heavy rope. In some sections, it has been paved over for joggers and cyclists. In others, it is still packed earth and gravel, overgrown with goldenrod and wild grape, the same ground that thousands of Irish workers walked every morning in the pre-dawn dark to reach their digging sections. If you walk it in early autumn, when mist rises off the old canal bed and the air carries the first bite of cold, you can almost feel the weight of what happened there. If you have valued this story, I ask that you subscribe. Not for my sake. For the men whose names we are still trying to recover, The contractor records survive. That is something worth knowing. Payroll books housed in the New York State Archives, written in iron gall ink that is faded to brown but not vanished, in handwriting that varies from clerk to clerk. Some entries are careful and precise. Others are barely legible scrawls scratched out by men writing in lamplight after long days of their own. But the names are there. Sullivan, Riley, O'Brien, Murphy, Gallagher, Brennan, Walsh, Kelly, Doyle, Connolly. Hundreds of Irish names, each one representing a man who showed up before dawn, picked up a shovel or an iron drill rod or a wheelbarrow handle, and moved the earth of New York State one load at a time. Most of them survived. That fact alone deserves to be said plainly, because it is too easy to tell this story as if the canal was nothing but a graveyard. It was not. The vast majority of the 9,000 lived through the work. They survived the malaria and the cholera and the blasting and the freezing winters and the debt and the whiskey and the daily contempt of the native-born Americans who used the canal every day without ever asking who had dug it. They survived, and they stayed, and they became Americans. Their children worked the docks and the factories. Their grandchildren fought at Antietam and Gettysburg. Their great-grandchildren built the bridges and tunnels and skyscrapers that defined the century that followed. Their descendants number in the millions today, scattered across this country, many of them unaware that their family's American story began in a muddy 8-foot ditch in upstate New York, with a long-handled shovel and a tin cup of whiskey. There is a stretch of the old canal bed near Palmyra, New York, where the towpath runs between 2 rows of enormous sugar maples. The trees were not there when the canal was dug. They grew up in the decades afterward, when the canal was still in daily operation, planted by someone whose name no surviving record preserves. They are massive now, their trunks wider than a man can wrap his arms around, their canopy so dense that the path beneath them stays cool and shaded even at noon on the longest day of the year. The roots of those trees have grown down through the layers of soil and time into the old canal bed itself, into the very earth that was turned and packed and shaped by Irish hands 200 years ago. I walked that stretch of towpath last autumn. The leaves were coming down, gold and rust and copper brown, covering the path in a soft carpet that muffled every step. And I thought about Patrick Sullivan, who came from County Cork and died in a swamp and has no grave that anyone alive today can visit. I thought about Michael Riley, who held a crew of frightened, exhausted men together at Lockport while they hammered through stone that did not want to yield. I thought about Thomas O'Brien, who watched men die of cholera all around him and survived for reasons that no record explains, and went back to work on the canal the following week, because what else was there for a man like him to do? I thought about the 9,000 who answered a handbill and crossed an ocean and dug a ditch that remade a nation. The earth remembers them, even if we forgot. The canal bed is still there beneath the pavement, beneath the parks, beneath the shopping centers and parking lots, and all the accumulated layers of 2 centuries of ordinary life that have been laid down over the top of it. 363 miles of ground that was broken by hand, by men who were promised 50 cents and a whiskey ration and a new life in America. Some of them got that new life. 1,000 of them got a hole in the ground with no name on it. And the rest of us got a nation connected to itself for the first time, a waterway that turned a young republic into a commercial force, and a debt we have never acknowledged, never marked with so much as a plaque, and certainly never repaid. The maple trees on the towpath at Palmyra do not know any of this. They simply grow. Their roots reach deep into the old canal bed, into the same earth those Irish ditchers turned with long-handled shovels 2 centuries ago. And they stand there, tall and quiet and indifferent to human history, the only living monuments to the men who built Clinton's impossible ditch. That is enough. That has to be enough. Because it is all they left us,